Chapter 5. Sheriff Yates took a camera from the trunk of the squad car, put on his gloves, and walked past the yellow police tape to the ditch where the body had been found. He knelt down and began to examine the area, taking pictures of the surroundings. He noticed the trampled brush leading to the tree line and saw broken branches where Ben had possibly come through. It appeared as though the victim had come to the road, collapsed and died, just as the medical examiner had speculated. Yates peered into the forest and saw more broken branches. "Over here, Peter!" Yates called out. Peter approached. "You called, sir?" "I want you to look around here for anything out of the ordinary, while Bonnie and I take a hike to see where these tracks lead." "Yes, sir," Peter replied. Bonnie approached Yates and looked at him, then at the bushes and trees, then back to Yates again.
"I'm not going in there with all those bugs skittering around."
Yates smiled, grabbed Bonnie by her coat, and took her away with him into the bush. They walked off together, following the trail of broken branches and crushed weeds. Yates and Bonnie kept following the path further into the trees when they heard a branch snap behind them. The two officers crouched down and took out their handguns. More cracks were heard, but they sounded as if they were heading away. Yates looked around and spotted a piece of white cloth on a broken tree limb. He pointed the cloth out to Bonnie, and the two officers quietly moved towards it. An animal suddenly jumped out from behind a tree near the cloth and startled the officers for a brief moment before scurrying away. The officers both let out a sigh. Yates took a plastic bag from his pocket and grabbed the torn cloth from the tree limb. "Piece of Ben's shirt."
"Fits the bill,"
Bonnie said. The officers commenced their hike again, carefully making their way through the trees until they reached a clearing with an old abandoned cabin in the center. They stopped and crouched down in the brush.
"Wonder if anyone's home,"
Bonnie said. Yates slowly stood up straight, looked around, and motioned to Bonnie to follow him. They dashed across the open clearing to the cabin and stood up against the front wall near the entrance door.
"The door is open,"
Bonnie whispered.
"Check around back while I look inside,"
Yates said quietly. He pushed the door open with his foot. The door slowly moved and made a long creaking sound. Yates peered inside, but saw that no one was there. Bonnie circled the cabin and met Yates at the front door.
"I didn't see anyone, and the back door is locked,"
she said.
"No one appears to be inside either,"
Yates said. Bonnie looked down and pointed to the bloodstains on the wood planks near the door. Yates bent down, snapped a few pictures, and rose to his feet. The two officers carefully walked into the cabin with their guns ready. They looked around, but there wasn't much there aside from a desk, radio, a few chairs, a stained floor, and a brick fireplace in the corner with a poker beside it and scorch marks around it. The place had an eerie, uneasy feel to it that sent shivers up Bonnie's spine. She saw the trail of blood drops on the floor that led from the front door to another room and glanced at Yates. Yates nodded his head. Bonnie slowly approached the room, opened the old creaky door, and immediately noticed a smell coming from inside. She quickly turned around and motioned to Yates to come over. Yates approached and entered the room. He looked around and saw an old bed with a stained sheet over it and a few lumps under the sheet. There was garbage and what looked like blood stains on the floor and a desk in the corner with a broken chair and a fan.
"Do you think this is where Ben was beaten?"
Bonnie said as her eyes continued to scan the room. The trail of blood leading from this room to outside would indicate that, Yates said. Who's on the bed? The two officers went over to the bed. Bonnie looked squeamishly at the blood-stained sheet and the lumps. Yates reached over and pulled the sheet back. Underneath, they found a severed head and a partial arm. Bonnie covered her mouth and gasped.
Who is it?
Using the barrel of his handgun, Yates rolled the head over face up, and they both saw who it was. It was Foreman Raymond Moore from the Reeves County mine. Go get Peter on the radio. Let him know what we found, but be careful. I'll keep looking around, Yates said. Bonnie nodded, went into the main room, and walked outside with her gun drawn, ready for anything that she might find. She took her walkie-talkie and held it to her mouth.
Peter, do you read me?
Static. Bonnie scanned the area and tried again.
Peter, where are you at?
More static, and finally Peter's voice came through.
I hear you, Bonnie.
What's going on? Did you find anything? Peter inquired.
We found a cabin with body parts, about a 5-minute hike straight ahead of where we went in. Grab a bag in the trunk of the squad car and bring it here.
Body parts? Anyone we... More static, and then suddenly a loud crack. And the radio went silent. Peter had been assaulted from behind at the roadside by a mysterious person who had been watching from the brush. Peter lay motionless on the ground. The stranger ran back across the road, hopped onto a dirt bike, and drove away.
Peter! Shit!
Bonnie yelled frantically into the radio. She ran back into the cabin and found Yates rifling through the desk drawer.
Robert, it's Peter! I think someone attacked him while we were talking.
Yates grabbed the papers he found and stuffed them into his pocket. The two officers quickly exited the cabin and ran into the clearing and through the trees. The birds flew off into the sky, and the shrubs cracked under the weight of their boots as the officers continued their way back as fast as they could. The officers found Peter lying on his stomach on the ground. Bonnie knelt beside him and turned him over. His eyes were closed, and he was unresponsive. She put her fingers on his neck to see if his heart was still pumping blood, and it was. She checked if he was breathing, and he was. Don't move him any more. I'll radio for help, Yates said, as he ran to the police cruiser. He opened the car door, took the radio in his hand, and looked around before he talked, but saw no one. Beth, Peter's been hurt. We need an ambulance.
Oh my! I'll call right away. How is he?
Unconscious. Yates put the radio back into the cruiser, walked over to Bonnie and Peter, and knelt down.
If I catch who did this to our Peter,
Bonnie began. I know. I feel the same way, Yates replied. He rose to his feet. I'm going to look around while we wait. Bonnie looked at Yates with concern in her eyes.
Don't go off too far.
Yates drew his handgun and started to look around while they waited for the ambulance. Suddenly, Peter began to stir and regain consciousness. He looked up at Bonnie and asked, What happened? I remember talking to you.
Easy, Peter. Robert called the ambulance. They should be here soon to take you to the hospital,
Bonnie said. It wasn't long before the ambulance arrived. Yates walked back, shaking his head. I found evidence of dirt bike tracks across the road in the trees, he said. Someone was watching, and now they're gone. I don't like it. The paramedics approached the officers. How is he? The first paramedic asked. Peter looked up and tried to stand as Yates and Bonnie helped him to his feet. He got hit on the head," Yates replied.
"Easy now. Come with us. You'll be all right,"
the second paramedic said.
"Sheriff, you two want to follow along behind us?"
"Go with him, Bonnie. I'll stay and head back to the cabin in case our mystery stalker returns. Bring Paul back here when you're done with Peter," Yates said. Bonnie nodded and joined Peter in the back of the ambulance. The ambulance sped off. Yates turned around and walked back into the brush, gun drawn, fully expecting more trouble. Yates emerged from the tree line and saw the abandoned cabin once more. The cabin stood there silent, holding on to its secrets. He approached the front door, carefully opened it, and stepped inside. He bent down, looked at what appeared to be fresh shoe marks on the floor, and touched them. He wiped his fingers on his pants and rose to his feet. He smelled the faint odor of cigarettes lingering in the air as he turned his head and faced the next room. Yates entered the room where he had found the body parts and noticed right away that the sheet on the bed was no longer there, and neither was the severed head and arm. "Shit," he said under his breath. He looked around the room and walked over to the bed. He moved the bed aside, revealing the blood-stained floor underneath and a few broken beer bottles. Yates bent down, took a cloth and bag from his coat pocket, and scooped up the glass pieces. He made out a partial brand name. He rose to his feet and approached the desk, shoved it out of the way, and saw barbed wire and a pair of wire cutters on the floor. He bent down and picked up the items, when suddenly he heard a noise and then smelled smoke. Someone had lit 2 fires, one inside the cabin and a second outside, next to the back door, near the propane tank. The arsonist circled to the front of the cabin, where a second person was waiting, hiding amongst the trees, with the body parts and bloody sheet in a garbage bag. Yates exited the room and tried to reach the front door when suddenly a shot rang out. Yates was now trapped between a shooter and a fire. He jumped back and looked around the room for something he could use as a distraction, but there was nothing, and his time was running short. "Think, you've been in tighter spots than this," he said to himself. The room began to fill with smoke. Yates started coughing. He looked outside the window and saw 2 perpetrators hiding behind trees, but couldn't make out their faces. They were wearing ski masks over their heads. Another shot hit the side of the cabin. He was pinned down with only one way out. He entered the room where he had found the body parts originally and took the mattress from the bed and brought it with him into the main room. "I must be crazy," he said. He stepped back, built up a full head of steam, and with the mattress protecting his body, ran through the burning room and crashed through the flaming rear exit door. He looked back and saw how bad the fire had become. The propane tank was engulfed with flames. He quickly hit the dirt and ducked under the mattress for safety. Suddenly, the propane tank exploded and sent a ball of fire into the air. Pieces of burning wood and debris from the old cabin flew everywhere. Yates peered out from underneath the mattress, saw the fire raging, and saw that the mattress he was hiding under had caught fire. He jumped out from under the mattress and drew his handgun. He went around the fire, saw the 2 perpetrators running away, and pursued them. Through the trees Yates ran, dodging bullets and jumping over rocks and tree limbs. Yates kept returning the shots and running until there was only silence. He stopped and listened. Suddenly, he heard the engine of a pickup truck and the motor of a dirt bike. Out of the trees, Yates flew and jumped over the ditch to the roadside. He saw the truck speeding away and the dirt bike roaring into the trees on the other side of the road. He looked around, recognized where he was, and began to walk back down the road to where he had left the police cruiser. Paul and Bonnie arrived in Paul's pickup truck as the sheriff was calling the fire department on his radio. "There he is," Paul said. Bonnie turned her head and waved at Yates. Yates approached Bonnie and Paul. "What happened? You look like you've been through a war zone," Paul said as he casually struck a match and lit a cigarette. Yates shook his head. "I feel like it." He began to tell them what had happened. "In the end, one got into a pickup truck and the other onto a dirt bike. One took off down the road and the other into the trees. One was driving a two-tone blue and white Chevy K20, and the other an orange Honda dirt bike with a broken rear fender. Unfortunately, I didn't get either of the plate numbers." "I guess you won't be needing my services then," Paul said. "I'll head back to the hospital. Look after him, Bonnie." Paul got into his pickup truck and left. The two officers waited for the fire department to arrive.